Hello everyone and welcome back to Just Finish Coding. My name is Sriram and this video is the third part of the Scratch Piano series. In case you haven't watched parts 1 and 2, there will be a card for you right here. By the end of this video, you will have the tempo coordinator completely set up. This sprite will allow the user to manipulate the tempo of the music played, thus in turn impacting how fast or how slow the metronome would play. Let's begin. We head over first to the tempo button sprite and start with the init clones message. When this message is received, we hide the sprite and clear the existing graphic effects. Following this, we set the tempo to 60. The tempo numbers can be quite confusing at first. If we want the tempo to play at a frequency of 1 beat per second, we set the tempo to 60. If the frequency should be 2 beats per second, we set it to 120. If the frequency should be half beat per second, the tempo should be set to 30. 60 just refers to the beats per minute, which means 60 beats per minute. You probably get the idea now. The user will have an opportunity to customize the tempo by increasing or decreasing it, but at the start, the tempo will have a default 1 beat per second. If you take a look at the costumes of this sprite, you will notice 4 costumes. A plus button, a minus button, a heading, and a background for the display of the number. We will set up each one of these clones of the tempo button sprite. Since we have the clones, we must delete all of them at the beginning. Once this is done, we will label each of the clones that we will create so that we can identify them and perform different tasks on them. The easiest way to do this is with the help of a private variable. We can call this variable clone ID, making sure that it is set for this sprite only. First, we set clone ID to plus and then create a clone. Next, we set clone ID to minus and then create a clone. After this, we set clone ID to heading and create a clone. And finally, we set clone ID to number and create a clone. The names of the costumes are of course similar to the clone IDs to allow for easy verification. Now that we have each clone with a distinctive clone ID, we can customize what each of them would do. Within the clone script, we first show and check if the clone ID is plus. We move this clone to the front layer and switch its costume to plus. The clone is positioned at x negative 172, y 120. Following this, we create a variable called wait lag for this sprite only. I will explain what this variable does after writing out its entire function. Initially, we set wait lag to 0. Within a forever loop, we check if the clone is touching the mouse pointer and the mouse is down. This will correspond to the player clicking the plus button. If this is true, we nest another if statement, checking if wait lag is greater than 8. If yes, then we change the tempo by 1, set wait lag to 0, and set the brightness effect to 30. Within the else statement, we have a nested if else, where we check if the clone is touching the mouse pointer. If yes, then we set the ghost effect to 40, and if no, we set it to 0. Outside the inner if else statement, but still within the outer if else statement, we set the brightness effect to 0. Outside both of these if else statements and within the forever loop, we change wait lag by 1. Alright, that was a lot to do at once, and I will try to explain what we're trying to do here. Let's first start with our objective, which is what we're trying to achieve. When the player clicks on the plus button, we want the tempo to increase by 1. This is why we put the change tempo by 1 block when the clone is clicked. However, if we do that without a wait lag, we get into a spamming problem. Given that Scratch runs at about 30 frames per second, even clicking on the plus button and holding on to the click for just a few milliseconds will lead to a change in tempo of 4 or 5 rather than just 1. If we leave the code like this, the player will find it very difficult to get the tempo to his desired amount. The player may want the tempo to be set at 65, but when he gets the tempo to 64 and presses the plus key, the tempo quickly changes to 67 or 68. In most projects, the solution to this conundrum would be to use the when sprite is clicked event. This will register only as a single click, even if the player holds on to the left mouse button for a long period of time. However, this method has a drawback because it severely slows down the player's ability to increase the tempo. One cannot hold on to the mouse button to increase the tempo, so if a player wanted to increase the tempo from 60 to 120, he would actually have to click on the mouse button 60 times. To avoid this pitfall and get the best of both worlds, we allow the user to hold on to the mouse pointer but restrict the number of times that the tempo can update. We have a counter called wait lag that increases by 1 each frame. We only increase this tempo if the wait lag is more than 8, and when we do, we set the wait lag back to 0. Thus, while the wait lag is in the range between 0 and 8, the spamming is restricted. Alright, that's the difficult part of the code. In addition to what I just explained, there are also a set of effects that we're programming the sprite to do. Whenever the button is clicked, we make it brighter to confirm to the player that he has clicked it. If the player's mouse is hovering over the button but he has not clicked it, we make the button slightly more transparent to acknowledge this movement. Great! If you test out the program now, you will be able to increase and decrease the tempo. The ghost effect may seem a bit weird, but that will look a lot better once we add in the remaining clones of this sprite. The code for the minus button is very similar to the plus button, so we can duplicate the entire if-then statement. First of all, we change the condition to check if clone ID is minus. We then switch the costume to minus and go to an X position of minus 68. This will mean that the minus button will be to the right of the plus button. When the minus button is clicked, we change tempo by -1. That's actually all the changes. If you test out the code again after making the tempo visible, you will see that the minus button works the exact same way. Again, the ghost effect may look a bit weird, but we will fix that shortly. In the third case, we will check if clone ID is heading. If yes, then we move the sprite over to the back layer and switch the costume to heading. Given that we want both the plus button and the minus button to stay above the heading, moving this clone to the back layer should be quite obvious. After this, we move to a position of X -120, Y 120. Okay, let's configure the last clone. The clone ID check should be number. This clone will be the background for where the magnitude of the tempo will be displayed. We move it to the front layer and then move it backwards 10 layers and finally switch the costume to the number background. The reason we do not make this clone remain in the front layer is because the numbers that will be displayed on top of this will be done in the tempo number sprite. Remaining at the front layer will cause this to cover the tempo number which is displayed above it. For the position, we go to X -120, Y 90. That will be all for the tempo button sprite. If you test out the program, the entire sprite should look quite good. The ghost effect, which is seen when the mouse hovers over the button, no longer looks weird and is a lot more acceptable. We wouldn't want the player to see the tempo displayed as a variable on top, so now we will code the program in such a way that the tempo will be displayed graphically as a number inside this empty rectangle. Great, let's now move on to the tempo number sprite. When the init clones message is received, we will delete all of the existing clones and hide the sprite itself. Once this is done, we will create a block called create clones. Since the clone should be created without any lag, we run this without screen refresh. We will need a way of identifying each clone, so we create a variable for this sprite only called clone ID. Initially, we set clone ID to 1 and within a repeat 3, create a clone and change clone ID by 1. The result of this will be 3 clones, each with a different clone ID. The first clone will have a clone ID of 1, the second clone will have a clone ID of 2, and the third clone will have a clone ID of 3. The music tempo can be any value from 20 to 500. These numbers refer to the beats per minute. 20 beats per minute is the slowest, while 500 beats per minute is the fastest. The tempo can be manipulated by the player, so it can be anywhere in this range. Each clone that we created will store one digit of the tempo. If you take a look at the costumes, you will see numbers from 0 to 9, and this should be quite self-explanatory. Alright, let's continue. When each clone is created, we make it go to the front layer and show. We position it at a Y value of 88 and an X value of -135 plus clone ID -1 multiplied by 15. This may seem confusing, but it will be clear when I explain why it works. We want the clones to be positioned in order from left to right. The first clone will be at a position of -135, and every clone after that will be to its right by 15 pixels. Thus, 15 is simply the distance between each clone. This way, the first clone will be positioned at an X position of -135, the second clone at a position of -120, and the third clone in a position of -105. Next, we enter into a forever loop and check if 3 minus clone ID is less than the length of tempo. If this is false, we switch costume to 0, and if this is true, we switch costume to letter, clone ID minus 3 minus length of tempo. Let's go through what's going on here. In case the tempo has only 2 digits, then we will keep the first digit as 0 and only change the last 2 digits. This is why we have the if-else statement. Let's now take the case where the tempo has 2 digits again. Here, the length of tempo will be 2. In this case, the second clone should take the value of letter 1 of tempo, and the third clone should take the value of letter 2 of tempo. Notice that we are subtracting 1 from clone ID in each case. However, if the tempo has 3 digits, then the first clone should take the value of the first digit, the second clone should take the value of the second digit, and the third clone should take the value of the third digit. Notice here that we're subtracting 0 from clone ID. Thus, fewer the number of digits, the more we subtract from clone ID to get the particular costume's index. 3 minus length of tempo will determine how many fewer letters are there in the tempo. We subtract this from clone ID in order to determine the index. Once we find this index, we can get whatever number is at the index of the tempo's magnitude. This is exactly what we're doing here. Perfect! That will be all that has to be done for this video. If you test out the program, the tempo numbers should display and update accurately. If you've enjoyed this video, please make sure you leave a like, and also don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.